Hello, family. This is African Esquire, and welcome to the Federation of African Liberation. We are a Pan-Africanist organization built for the purpose of uniting Africans throughout the diaspora with Africans on the continent for the purpose of mutual liberation for all of our people. So today I want to talk about some foolishness that has been going on that I've seen reported in the news. And, I wanted to talk about this because I'm learning more and more about the media's propaganda campaign, how we're supposed to identify certain people as our allies and certain people as our enemies. And in this case, the media has basically taught us from a young age that we're supposed to look at Israel as an ally in the United States. More and more people are pushing back at that accusation, but this is something that has been well accepted inside of politics. Politicians, if they do not come out in support of Israel, they know that they face staunch opposition in both parties. So this is something that is basically established in the United States politics, that if you're in America, it's politically correct to identify yourself as someone who supports Israel. Now, the problem with that is that Israel is actually extremely anti-African. It's extremely white supremacist, and the things that has been done in the country of Israel mirror things that have been done in South Africa, things that were done in the Jim Crow South. It's really a modern day apartheid regime, and people are afraid to say those things. People are afraid to actually not support the country of Israel. But anyone who has a sense of moral direction as far as understanding the history of white supremacy, as far as Africans in America, Africans anywhere in the diaspora, should understand that anytime that a regime will use such force, such violence against people who have done nothing to deserve it, that all of that regime should be called out in the name of those people. Now, in this context, we're going to talk about Pharrell, who, as we all know, is a very famous African, so-called African American musician. And basically, I'm reading from an article on Face to Face Africa. On November 1st, a group of people came together at a gala in Beverly Hills. They were there for one thing: funding for the Israeli Defense Forces. So the fundraiser was to support an army, which is odd in itself. What purpose would you have in supporting an army of an outside country? Like, what purpose would you have in doing that? And the answer is that the American propaganda machine has taught us that supporting the Israeli army is the right thing to do, but we don't really question why. So this was organized by Friends of Israel Defense Forces, and it brought together politicians and singers, business people, and top Hollywood stars, including Ashton Kutcher, Gerard Butler, Andy Garcia, singer Seal, who is black, and former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Over $60 billion was raised at this gala, whose main performer was none other than Pharrell Williams, the musician who considers himself an activist beyond his music. And notice they said considers himself an activist. You should never be, in modern terms, impressed when someone says they consider themselves an activist. Activist is such a bland term, honestly. You could be an activist and still be an activist for a cause that goes contrary to justice. You can be an activist for white supremacy, and clearly in this context, that doesn't mean much. In Hollywood, everyone's an activist. You have activists for animals. You have activists for abortion. You have activists for women's rights. You have activists for gay rights. You have activists for all types of things in Hollywood. Being an activist doesn't make you someone who actually is a revolutionary in the terms of fighting back when it comes to mass oppression. It just means that you found a cause that you care enough about to speak out against. So activist to me is not a badge. I don't like calling myself an activist. To me, the only thing to be is either you're revolutionary or you're not. If you're not, then whatever. You can be in the activist category. But activist is not a really powerful label, and I think that's just something for us to understand. So going back to the article, so he took this stage and performed his song Happy. He had a few words about the recent shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, which is interesting. So he says, "Look what happened in that synagogue. That was incredibly cruel. It was wrong, and it's not supposed to be what our nation is, Williams said. The group of people who have been tested over and over and over again, but you guys show an incredible resilience. I'm going to come back to that when I finish reading through the article. So the performance came under criticism at a time when Israeli defense forces are carrying out attacks on Palestinians, leading to deaths and gross violations of human rights. The most recent news report indicates that 7 Palestinians in Gaza were killed early Monday morning by Israeli forces. Israel has been known to be anti-African, kicking out asylum seekers from the country and instituting policies to make their lives even harder, including seizing the wages from Africans to compel them to exit Israel. Many people are now wondering how Pharrell has for the longest time painted himself as an advocate for change, ended up performing at such a gala. The same Pharrell had sent a cease and desist letter to U.S. President Donald Trump for him to stop using his song Happy at his rallies. It is, however, not the first time that the award-winning musician has been called out for his pro-Israeli support. In 2015, he came under fire for collaborating with South Africa's Woolworths, which had been importing goods from Israel. Hundreds of people protested against him during his concert in Cape Town. So that shows you right there the argument that, maybe he didn't know what he was doing. First of all, he has faced backlash before for supporting pro-Israeli forces. So if he still does not understand the horrible human rights infractions that have been committed in Israel, after having received backlash already, that just means he either already understands that he's making a conscious decision to support this regime, or he is intentionally, purposefully ignorant and not learning and not bothering to actually do research. So the thing about Israel is, and I know this is a channel that focuses primarily on African issues. So some people might be saying, this is not an African issue. Why are you talking about this? Why aren't we talking about some other African conflict? We have to understand that as far as Israel is anti-African. They have always been anti-African. In fact, a lot of people don't know, prior to settling in Palestine, which is where the nation of Israel is today, there is talks to actually have the state of Israel settle inside of Uganda. So what happened is, under Zionism, you had people who were looking to basically oust people who were already living in their native lands and to start a new country that would be somewhere where Jews could live peaceably without having to worry about people like the Nazis or whatever trying to take their lives. And at that point, they were talking about, let's talk about Uganda. Well, by God's grace, they didn't go to Uganda, but they ended up going to Palestine. But understand, anytime that you would be willing to do that anywhere, you'd certainly be willing to do that same thing in Africa. The other thing to understand is that Israel has supported anti-African forces a number of times. The most notably is Israel was in support of the apartheid regime. Apartheid South Africa, which, if you don't know, committed mass horrible killings of African people. Some of the most vile killings, if you actually just read, things that you weren't just trying to kill someone, you were trying to destroy the consciousness of the people. You're trying to destroy the will to fight back. They committed horrible killings of hundreds of thousands of African people, and Israel was a regime that supported the apartheid regime. This is their history with African people. And of course, as of recently, Israel has been expelling African immigrants who try to seek asylum by going to Africa. By going to Israel. So let's say you're in a war-torn state, you go to Israel, they have actually refused to give asylum to such people. In fact, I was just reading another article from Face to Face Africa, and it was discussing because Israel has asked Ghana to back them in order to allow them back into the African Union, because Israel isn't recognized as a legitimate state in all the other national bodies, because it isn't a legitimate state. It's actually an illegal settlement. The settlement isn't even illegal by the United Nations standards, because in order to have gotten approval for their settlement, they went through the General Assembly of the United Nations, but they would have had to go through the Security Council, and they never were able to do that. Because of that, Israel is an illegal settlement unto this day. So because they can't receive the same legitimacy inside of bodies like the European Union or the United Nations, they went to the African Union, which is very interesting, again, given their discriminatory record against Africa. So I'm going to read just briefly from this article, skip around and read some excerpts. Israel has called on the Ghanaian government to back its bid as an observer status in the African Union, which it lost in 2002 when the former Organization of African Union was dissolved and replaced by the AU. Now, it says, according to, I cannot pronounce this name, according to Abraham Negus, I hope I pronounced that correctly, an Ethiopian Jew and chairman of the Likud coalition party and the Israeli Ignet, who met with the delegation, Africa and Israel have a relationship that dates back thousands of years, and it's time to come together, reports the Ghanaian media. He also added that the readmission of Israel to the African Union as an observer will help attract Israeli investment to Africa, because we all know that when it comes to corrupt leaders in Africa, all you have to say is, very bland words or abstract words like we're going to invest in your country, and then they're all gung-ho for doing basically anything that you want them to do. A similar call was made by Netanyahu, who visits to Liberia to attend the ECOWAS Heads of State Summit in 2017, and then to Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda. So listen to what he said. And if you don't know Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't know if I said his name right either, he's very anti-African. And he's very clear, like when it came to expelling immigrants from Israel, he doesn't view them as being Israeli, even though some of these people have been there for years and years and years. So he said, Israel should once again be an observer state of the African Union. I fervently believe this. Believe that it's in your interest too, telling the African people it's in the interest of Africa. I hope all of you will support that goal. Scrolling forward, he says that I ask for your support in rejecting anti-Israel bias at the United Nations and in bodies such as the General Assembly, the UNESCO, and the Human Rights Council. He appealed while adding that Israel is a nation that loves and respects all. In Israel, Jews, Christians, Muslims live side by side as equal citizens. This is the real Israel. We know this is not true. Africans do not live equally in Israel side by Israelis. So, scrolling down. Okay, so the so-called the country had introduced in 2008 a bill that allows the withholding of 20% of the salaries, which I just said, of African asylum seekers who can only be reclaimed after they leave the country. This is so-called deposit law requires employers of migrants to give the state 20% of their salaries and to store an additional 16%. A pension fund which will equally be inaccessible until the migrants decide to leave the country. Worse, employers of migrants have been directed to pay an additional tax to discourage them from employing the asylum seekers who are already grappling with finding jobs. Since 2009, only 8 Eritreans and 2 Sudanese have been recognized as refugees in Israel. Think about that. Only 8 and 2 Sudanese. Another 200 from Darfur were recently granted humanitarian status. Currently, 27,500 Eritreans and 7,800 Sudanese are seeking asylum status to start living in Israel. The African Union is yet to take action on the fate of these Africans who are in distress. So that would be very crazy if, and honestly, it wouldn't surprise me given the decisions that are being made by African leaders in support of foreign governments without having anything given back in return. But it'd be very surprising and interesting if the African governments were willing to allow Israel to be an observer inside of the African Union and actually not do anything about the fact that Israel has practiced discriminatory practices against African people, that you have asylum seekers who are seeking refuge in Israel. Israel does border Africa, so why should they be exempt from having to grant asylum to certain people? But more than likely, this will go unaddressed, even if Israel does get permission to actually be an observer in the African Union. So this shows you the perverse nature of Israeli relations with African people. There was also, I remember about a year ago, reading an article about Ugandan Jews, and these are people who practice Judaism, trying to get access to, trying to claim Israel as their homeland, because the idea of Israel is that it's supposed to be a homeland to Jews, not by ethnicity, but by people who are religious. And the Israeli government told this Ugandan congregation that they were not Jews. They did not count as Jews to them. And so what's the qualifier to be called a Jew? And a lot of times it seems like they're using the qualifier being labeled of being a European Jew, or what some people would call Ashkenazi Jews. So I want to go back to the article about Pharrell, because there was something interesting. So I thought it was interesting that he mentioned in his speech at the performance that he did, the incident that happened in Pittsburgh. And if you don't know, there was a shooting, a mass shooting that happened in Pittsburgh. Was it 7 people who were killed? I believe about 7 or 8 people were killed. I don't see the number. But it was at a synagogue. Now, the reason why I found this interesting is because the equation of mass killings in a synagogue and the way to basically remedy that is to support the Israeli Defense Forces. And this is where I really want to hammer down on this definition of Zionism for Black people, if you don't know. We are oftentimes given this definition of anti-Semitic, or what it means to support Jewish people. The way that it's been framed in the media is that anything that's anti-Israel, anything that goes against that regime is anti-Semitic. You have to be actually more specific with what you're talking about, because Zionism is not Judaism. Judaism is a religion that was practiced long before it ever entered Europe. It was practiced in Israel. It's been practiced in Africa. It's actually not even from Europe. So this is an ancient religion of African people, of some Arab people. Now, that's Judaism. It's a religion that's practiced. Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is a more recent creation. And Zionism is basically the idea that after Jews were all scattered all over the world, that there should be somewhere, an actual place where Jews can go and relocate and call that place their homeland. The place that they decided to settle on was Palestine. Now, Palestine, of course, was already inhabited by people who have been living in Palestine for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, if you do a DNA test of people who are Palestinian and compare it to people who are Jewish or Israeli, they have found that the DNA of the Palestinians is more closely related to the actual Hebrews, the real Israel, the nation of Israel that is written about in the Bible. So the claim that these people from Europe have more of a claim to the land inside of Palestine is just false. They don't have the ethnic claim. And to say that there's a religious claim, well, on what basis? What basis do you think your religion gives you the right to claim a territory over people who actually have lived there for a long time? Could you imagine like what would happen, the hell that would break loose if there was like a Muslim referendum that says that we need a Muslim homeland, so we're going to take over Switzerland and we're going to say that that's our homeland and we need people to support us? You would hear all types of people going nuts. And so the question is, if it's not right for them to do it, why is it okay for Zionists to have this position? And by the way, there are lots of Jews who are actually not Zionists. That's why you have to have a separation between what a Zionist is and versus what a Jew is. People will call Minister Louis Farrakhan anti-Semitic. I don't think he's anti-Semitic. I think he's very anti-Zionist. But the issue is that the way that Zionism has been conflated with Judaism is that you have a lot of people who will criticize Zionism, and because we've been taught to think of Zionism as Judaism, we're going to look at those people and say, oh, they're all anti-Semitic, and not actually question, well, where are you actually calling the critique? The critique is, how dare you feel like you have the right to go into another country? And this is what, Europeans have been doing forever, right? Because they did this in America. This place was inhabited by Native Americans. They said, oh, we're going to go over there and we're going to call that land our own. They did this in Latin America. They did this in Africa, especially South Africa, where you actually have apartheid regimes. Namibia, you have so many examples throughout the world where Europeans have already done this. And so to them, this is business as usual. I promise you, if the Jews were if the Israelis were Jews from a different region of the world, like let's say they were the Ugandan Jews saying that, hey, we want to go to Israel and actually have that be our country, have that be our nation, and we want the backing of the United Nations, with the backing of all these people, it wouldn't happen, because it's only going to be reinforced for white people to do these things. For Europeans to have these type of settlements, it's never going to be agreed upon or seen as legitimate for any other person to exercise this type of barbaric land seizures that have been taking place under European regimes. So all of this is to say that for him to conflate the killing, the mass shooting, and trust me, that was a horrible shooting. Any time that life is actually taken from people, we should all be special innocent people, not just people who are just chilling, but innocent people. Not just people who are actually implicated in the violence, but innocent people. Anytime that happens, we should all feel something, and I certainly felt something for them. But the idea that is equal to Zionism, and therefore, as Hollywood people do, and they always want to jump on issues that are time sensitive, to go and do a concert to support a Zionist military force that is doing things to people that are barbaric, that are horrifying. I mean, I remember one video I seen of the Israeli Defense Forces spraying. They were driving through a neighborhood of Palestinians, and their military tanks were spraying something, and it was said in the video that they were spraying human feces at the houses of the Palestinians, and that's what you call psychological warfare. That's not even, I just don't want you here. That's, I want to destroy your consciousness. I want to destroy your sense of humanity. It's a whole nother level. So it's ironic. It's sad, but we also have to understand, and I'll say this in concluding, that as Africans in America, we have been taught that it's better to identify with the oppressor and the oppressor's ways than to identify with our own people who have the same interests as us. So when I say that, I'm talking about people who are in other parts of the world who are the victims of these same systems. And remember, we were victims, and we're still victims, but more explicitly, we were victims of these same practices. We were victims of Jim Crow, victims of slavery. So you would think that we would be sensitive to people who are victims of these same types of systems under white supremacy. Instead, what we have been taught to do is to integrate into white supremacy and join in their efforts. So rather than try to stop these things from happening, we join in with the oppressor, thinking that the oppressor is legitimate. We join in with the oppressor and don't try to stop the horrible killings, don't try to stop the injustices, but instead we become a part of it. And we think that that's fine. But we have to start questioning, what are your interests? Your interest in the United States cannot be that you just accept what is done by the oppressor. Because trust me, if the oppressor looked at you, like if the white supremacists looked at you as one of them, you wouldn't be in a situation where you're in these ghettos caged in like animals. You wouldn't be in a situation where you go to the prisons and are filled with your people, you wouldn't be in a situation where you have to be afraid every single day that you send your child outside that that child might be shot by the police for something that they had nothing to do with, or for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You wouldn't have to be afraid of these things. So they've showed you that you are never going to truly be one of them. So the idea that you join in with them and that's the best way to do it, I mean, I always criticize when I see Africans in America who will join the United States military. Like, they don't understand the interest of the people who you're shooting or doing these drone attacks on 9 times out of 10 actually align more with your interests. They're the same victims of imperialism that you are. I mean, the same way that you're facing police killings, these people are facing killings by the same oppressive force, the same system. So why would you identify with the oppressor and take part in the slaying of your people? That's the question. So just to sum this up, I'm not surprised that Pharrell did this. And as it said in the article, he already knew that he had to know, because he already had a previous incident where he's already been called out for supporting the Israeli regime. But for all of us who aren't celebrities or don't necessarily have the same influence and platform as him, let us be the voice that says that, no, we know that Zionism is evil. Zionism has always been something that's against our people, and Zionism is something that we have to speak out against, that we have to actually protest against and actually work against, because anything other than that is a jeopardizement of our safety, because African people have been the victims of this system and still are the victims of the system. So that's all I have for you all. I love to see your comments, and we will see you all in another video.